Some of you might know that occasionally over the past few years, I've made several trips with my wife. My wife has in the past done a lot of traveling, not so much right now, but she's done a lot of traveling, and I've had the opportunity, pleasure even, to accompany her on several trips. And one particular trip that we took a few years back was to go to a remote part of the United States. You know, we've heard a lot this past election season about the flyover states. Well, this is how you get to some of those flyover states and some of those flyover cities. And so as we were sitting in the airport to get on the plane to go to our destination, we looked out and this was the plane. She was not impressed at all. And we had a said conversation about getting on the plane and her getting on the plane. And I reminded her that we had taken this plane several years before and we had survived. And that most likely we would survive again, but she was not impressed. And we began to have a discussion about whether or not to rent a car to go to our destination, to which I reminded her that she did not like long drives in a car. Finally, we ended up on the tarmac and began boarding the plane. Now, this particular plane was so small, there were no flight attendants. And the pilot that greeted us as we to embark on the plane said, "There is no room for your carry-on luggage. No overhead bins. So the bags have to be stowed in the back." And as you can see, he wasn't joking. No place for luggage, no room under the seat for your feet, let alone a bag. And so, as you can also see, there is no cabin door between the cockpit and the cabin. And this was post 9/11. Let's imagine for a moment that you and I and a few other people were going to charter this plane to go on a trip. Now, this is most likely how it would begin.
Service to Phoenix, Arizona will be underway here in just a couple minutes. 2 hours and 2 minutes once we're airborne. Should be a smooth ride over. Just a little bit of weather around El Paso. Should be above it. For a nice smooth ride over to Phoenix. Seatbelt sign is on. If you're up and about, we'd ask you to find that seat. Make sure that seatbelt is securely fastened. We'll be underway as soon as we get everybody tucked away. And with any luck, we'll have you get a little bit early in Phoenix. Great night for an airplane ride. Thanks for coming with us. Sit back, relax, enjoy it. Welcome aboard.
So we get on this plane together and we take off. And everything's going smooth and we climb to our cruising altitude. 28,000 feet, and all of a sudden there's one of the engines blows out. And the pilot comes racing out of the cockpit and he says, "The plane's going down. We're going to crash. We got to bail out." And we all look at each other like, huh? What's he talking about? Bail out? What are we going to do? Well, it's a good thing he knows where the parachutes are. And so he passes the parachutes out to us. We take the parachutes and he gives us a quick how to put them on, how to pull the ripcord, and we line up at the door. And he throws open the cabin door. And as he throws open the cabin door, we look at something like this. First passenger comes up to the door and says, "Can I make a request?" And the pilot says, "What?" He goes, "Can I make a request?" "What's your request?" "Can I get a peak parachute, please?" And the pilot goes, "What are you talking about? I'd like a peak parachute." And the pilot goes, "Huh? No." And gives the guy a little shove out the plane. The second person comes up to the door and the pilot looks at him and he looks back at the pilot and the guy goes, "I was wondering, could you please ensure that I don't have any nausea as I fall?" And the pilot goes, "Are you kidding me? I gave you a parachute for the fall. That's enough." And the guy jumps. Third person comes up to the door and says, "Captain, I'm afraid of heights." And the captain goes, "I gave you a parachute. What else would you like?" And the guy goes out the door. Another person steps up and says, "Captain, I've got an idea. Let's change the plan." Let's crash the plane. Maybe we'll survive. You never know. I've read about some people surviving plane crashes before. Pilot just shakes his head, gives him a gentle shove out the door. Last person steps up and says, I have a great idea. Let's wait till the plane gets closer to the ground before we jump. That way maybe we'll survive, have a better chance. The pilot has given each passenger the only survival tool necessary to make the jump. But are we content? No. We're restless. We're anxious. We're demanding. Too crazy to seem possible? Maybe with pilots and parachutes, but how about on earth with people and grace? You see, God hears thousands of requests per second, every day. And some of these requests are legitimate. We too ask God to remove our fear. We too ask God to change the plans. And usually, God answers with a gentle shove that leaves us airborne, suspended only by His grace. See, there are times when the thing that you want, the thing that you desperately want, is the thing you never get. We're not picky. We're not demanding. We're just obeying God's command to, in everything, through prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. All you want is an open door or an answered prayer, and you'll be grateful. You'll be thankful. So you pray and wait. No answer. You pray and you wait. Nothing. You pray and you wait. Now, at this point, may I ask a very important question? What if God says no? What if the request is delayed or denied? When God says no, how will you respond? If God says, I've given you my grace, and that's enough, will you be content? Content. That's the word. A state of mind in which you would be at peace if God gave you nothing more than you already had. I want to ask you to test yourself with this question. If God's only gift to you was His grace to save you, would you be content? I mean, we beg Him to save the life of a child or a friend, plead with Him to make sure that our business doesn't go under. We beg Him to help us find a job, help us through the mess. Please, Lord, heal me. Take away the pain. Remove the cancer. What if the answer is, my grace is sufficient? My grace is enough. Would you be content? You see, from God's perspective, grace is enough. If God did nothing else but save us from hell, could we complain? I mean, if God saved our souls and left us on a deserted island with leprosy to live out our lives, would He be unjust? I mean, we've been given eternal life, and we're going to complain about an aching body? We've been given heavenly riches. Dare we complain about earthly poverty? Let me be quick to add, God has not given us just salvation. If you have ears to hear and eyes to see, He's already given you grace upon grace. Most of us have been saved and then blessed over and over again. Blessed more and more. But there are those times when God, having given us His grace, hears our request and says, my grace is sufficient for you. My question is God being unfair? Is God still a good God when he says no? The Apostle Paul wrestled with this issue. He knew the feeling of unanswered prayer. At the top of his prayer list was an unidentified request, and it dominated his thoughts. He gave it a code name. He said in 2 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, to keep me from being conceited, because of these surpassing great revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. Maybe the pain that Paul experienced was too personal, too intimate to put on paper. Maybe the request happened so often that he had reduced it to an abbreviation. Here I am again, Lord, to talk about the thorn. Or maybe by leaving it generic, Paul's prayer can become our prayer. For don't we all have a thorn? Don't we all have a thorn in the flesh? I mean, our flesh has been pierced by somebody or something. Our walk has become a limp. Our pace is slowed to a stop. And we try to walk again, and every time we take a step, we wince in pain. Finally, we plead with God, Lord, help me. This was the case with Paul. Now, I find it encouraging to notice that even Paul had a thorn in the flesh. You know, it's comforting to know that one of the writers of the Bible wasn't always on the same page with God. I mean, you don't get a thorn unless you're on the move. You don't get a thorn standing still. And Paul was always on the move. He never stopped. Thessalonica, Jerusalem, Athens, Corinth. If Paul wasn't preaching, he was in jail because of his preaching. But his walk had slowed. This thorn, this pain, this barb pierced through the sole of his sandal and into the soul of his heart. And it became a matter of intense prayer. And Paul says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it from me. This was no casual request, no P.S. at the end of a letter. It was the first plea of the first sentence. Dear God, I need help. Every time he took a step, the shudder of the pain shot up his leg. 3 different times he limped to the side of the road and prayed. His request was very clear. And God's response was just as clear. God's response was, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. So what was this thorn in the flesh that Paul had? What was it that caused this pain? And we don't know for sure, but the top candidates are, number 1, sexual temptation. You say, Paul, the apostle, sexually tempted? Well, he was a single man, after all. And he describes the temptress as if he knew her firsthand. He said, I don't want to do the things that are good. I'm sorry, let me start over. I want to do the things that are good. See how it works? That's how it works. We want to do the things that are good, and we don't. And we don't want to do the things that are bad, and we do them. And that's what Paul said. I want to do the things that are good, but I do not do them. I do not do the things I want to do, but I do the bad things I don't want to do. Is Paul asking God once and for all to deliver him for the thirst of forbidden waters? It could be. Maybe the problem was the flesh, or maybe the problem was foes. Not temptation, but opposition. The passage hints at this possibility. It says, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassing great revelations, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger to torment me, a messenger of Satan. Now, believe it or not, the Apostle Paul had his share of opponents. There were those that questioned his apostleship. There were some that undermined his message of grace. By the way, when Paul wrote that a messenger of Satan was sent to beat me, he wasn't exaggerating. Remove his robe and look at his scars. Or since you can't, check out his Instagram. Oh, I'm sorry, they didn't have Instagram back then. Or since you can't do that, let's look at the list from chapter 11. I've been near death many times. 5 times the Jews gave me their punishment of 39 lashes with a whip. 3 different times I was beaten with rods. 1 time I was almost stoned to death. That word has a different meaning today than it did back then, especially in the state of California, but I think he was talking about large rocks, stoned to death. Just want to point that out for those of you that might not understand what that means. 3 times I was in ships that wrecked, and one of those times I spent a night and a day in the sea. I've gone on many travels, and I've been in danger from rivers, thieves, my own people, the Jews, and those who are not Jews. I've been in danger in cities, in places where no one lives, and on the sea, and I've been in danger with false Christians. Could anyone fault Paul for asking for a timeout, please? I mean, the body can only take so much. One grows tired of living in the crosshairs of Satan's scope. God, what if this year we limit the attacks to verbal attacks so my sores can heal? Or could we stagger the whippings and the stonings so that they're not at the same time? I've got a bruise on my neck that wakes me up every time I roll over. And remember that night in the jail in Philippi? My back still hasn't recovered. Of course, there are those that thought that Paul deserved every single slash that he got, which leads us to the third option. Some think the thorn in the flesh was Paul's abrasive nature. What did Paul do before his conversion? What did he do? Paul's job before he knew grace was killing Christians. And Paul's job after he knew grace, he grilled them. Example, Galatians, the 2nd chapter. When Peter came to Antioch, I challenged him to his face because he was wrong. Boy, what a diplomat Paul is. He should be ambassador to Russia. In Paul's view, you were either on God's side or on Satan's side. And should you slide from one side to the other, he didn't keep it a secret. Hymenaeus and Alexander have done that, and I've given them to Satan so they will learn not to speak against God. Imagine Paul on Facebook. Imagine if he had a Twitter account. Everybody within the range of his pen or his tongue knew how he felt, and they knew when to duck. On the other hand, a case could be made that the thorn was not sexual temptation, nor was it opposition, or Paul's public relations skills that he lacked. But it could have been his body. Remember the words at the end of one of his letters? He said, "See what large letters I used to write this myself?" It could have been Paul's eyes were bad. I mean, let's think back. When Paul was converted, when he found Jesus, he was on the road to Damascus to kill Christians. And a bright light came out of the sky, and it was so bright that Paul was blind for 3 days. It could be he never recovered. It could be that his clear vision of the cross came at the cost of a clear vision of anything else. The Galatians said this: you would have taken out your own eyes and given them to me if that were possible. Poor eyesight can be an occupational hazard. It's not like you can call up Uber for a ride. If you can't see the trail, you can't see the trail. It's kind of hard to travel. And Paul's other job was writing letters. He wrote the Bible, a lot of the Bible. It's kind of hard to write when you can't see the page. And I don't know how many of you know this, but when you have poor vision, you tend to get strained eyes, which leads to headaches and long nights and long prayers. God, any chance I could see? You know, it's hard to impress a crowd when you're focused on a tree that you think's a person. Which brings to mind one final possibility. We assume that Paul was a dynamic speaker, but those who heard him might disagree. His speaking is nothing, he overheard them say in Corinth. Paul didn't argue with them. When I came to you, I was weak and fearful and trembling. My teaching and preaching were not with words of wisdom that persuade people, but of the proof of the power that the Spirit gives. Translation: I was so scared that I stuttered. I was so nervous that I forgot my point. And the fact that you heard anything at all is a testimony to God. Can a thorn really be too much? Can it be too much? Here's a clip from the movie War Horse.
I used to believe that God gave each man his fair portion of bad luck. I don't feel that anymore. I have more than my share.
I think that epitomizes the Apostle Paul. I've got more than my share. Now, let's back away for a minute and tally this up. I don't know how you've envisioned the Apostle Paul all these years, but that image might change. He was tempted often, beaten regularly. He was opinionated. He was dim-sighted. And he was thick-tongued. This, my friends, is the Apostle Paul. Maybe the reason he never got married was because he couldn't get a date. No wonder people question his apostleship. But here's the point. Are any of these requests inappropriate? I mean, let's think about it for a minute. Wouldn't Paul be a better apostle without temptation? Wouldn't Paul be a better apostle with no enemies? Wouldn't he be a better apostle if he had a calm demeanor? Wouldn't he be a better apostle if he had good eyes and a good tongue? Maybe. But maybe not. Had God removed temptation from Paul's life, would Paul have ever embraced God's grace the way he did? I mean, just look at the title on his office door. Paul, chief of sinners. No pen ever articulated grace like Paul's. No person ever appreciated grace like Paul. Had God stopped the whips, Paul may have never known if I were burned alive for preaching the gospel, but did not love others, it would be no value whatsoever. In the end, Paul's motives were credited to one force. The love of Christ controls us. If God had made him meek and mild, who would have faced the legalist? If God would have made him meek and mild, who would have confronted the hedonist. If God made Paul meek and mild, who would have challenged the judgmentalist? The reason that the letter of Galatians is in your Bible is because Paul couldn't stomach diluted grace. The letters to Corinth, because Paul's intolerance of sloppy faith. You see, Paul's honesty might not have made many friends, but it sure made a lot of disciples. In Paul's eyes, if God had healed his eyesight, would Paul have seen so many insights? I mean, while the rest of the world was watching the world, Paul was seeing visions too great for words. And public speaking. Nothing intoxicates like the approval of a crowd. God may have just been keeping Paul from thinking too much of himself. Whatever the affliction, it was there for one purpose. And Paul knew what that purpose was: to keep me from being conceited. The God who despises pride did whatever was necessary to keep Paul from becoming proud. In this case, he simply told Paul, "My grace is sufficient." In your case, he may be saying the same thing. You wonder why God doesn't remove temptation from your life? If he did, you might lean on your own strength instead of his grace. A few stumbles might be what is needed to convince you that his grace is sufficient for your sin. You wonder why God doesn't remove the enemies in your life. Please, God, take them away. Maybe because he wants you to love like he loves. Anybody can love a friend, but only a few can love an enemy. So what if you're not everybody's hero? His grace is sufficient for your self-image. You wonder why God doesn't alter your personality. You, like Paul, are a bit rough around the edges. You say things you later regret. Do things you later question. Why doesn't God make you more like him? He is. He's just not finished. Until he is, his grace is sufficient to overcome your flaws. You wonder why God doesn't heal you, take away the pain. He has healed you. If you're in Christ, you have a perfected soul and a perfected body. His plan is to give you the soul now and the body when you get to heaven. He may choose to heal parts of your body now before heaven. But if he does, or if he doesn't, does that change us being grateful? If God gave you nothing more than eternal life, could you ask for anything more? His grace is sufficient for me to be grateful, for me to be thankful. You wonder why God doesn't give you a skill. If only God made me a singer. If only God made me a runner or a writer or a missionary. And there you are, tone deaf, slow foot in mind. Don't despair. His grace is still sufficient. His grace is enough to finish what he began. And until he's finished, let Paul remind you that the power is in the message and not the messenger. His grace is sufficient to clearly speak even when we don't. This, I believe, is what Paul would be singing if he was standing before you.
Your grace is enough for
that we don't know about the thorns, we can be sure of this. God would much rather us have an occasional limp than a perpetual strut. And if it takes a thorn for God to make his point, he loves us enough not to pluck it out. God has every right to tell us no. And we have every right to tell him thanks. The parachute is strong. It's safe. The landing will be safe. His grace is enough. What about you? Is God's grace enough? What more could you ask for? He loves me. I know he loves me. I know he found me. I know he saved me. And his grace will never fail me. I know that heaven lives